Welcome to Africa's Vision Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. The title of our program is Alternate Education with a Self-Esteem Foundation. We have a very, very special guest with us today, Mr. Obi Egbuna, Jr. Welcome, Obi.
How you doing, Brother Omar? Thank you for having me on tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and we have so much to get through within a short window of time. But Obi, tell us a little bit about, I believe you were born in London, England.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
I was in London till I was 3 years old, lived in the Republic of Nigeria till I was 7, and I've been in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area ever since, with occasional departures back to Africa, to the Republic of Zimbabwe.
Tell us about your connection to Nigeria.
My connection to Nigeria is on my father's side. And my connection to Nigeria is part of the colonialist experience, British colonialism. And since Britain is the architect of colonialism, settler colonialism we speak of, invasion, rape, conquering, plunder, that's my relationship to Nigeria. That's my relationship to Africa. Resistance and the decolonization process, and understanding my historical responsibility to wage endless resistance, uncompromising resistance in relationship to the decolonization process.
And so, Obi, this understanding, and obviously you're real clear and you understand very clearly as to what's what. Where did that come from? How did your foundation begin for you to grasp this understanding?
Exposure in the home. My father, Obi Egbuna, Sr., who passed away 4 years ago, is one of the founders, the co-founder, along with another brother named Michael X, of the Black Panther Party in London. For those who think that the Black Panther Party was exclusively a United States phenomena, nothing could be further from the truth. We saw the Panthers in India. We saw the Panthers in Australia. We saw the Panthers in Jordan, and definitely in London. So my father was one of the co-founders there. And and as we say, if there's a line thinner than the one between love and hate, it's the one between exposure and imposition. We want to expose our people to everything under the sun, but force nothing under them. So I was privileged to be in a household with someone who was no stranger to the ranks of frontline struggle, and a mother who bought into the narrative. So I was exposed and had the highest level of quality exposure, at least I like to think so.
Now, you mentioned exposed, and I'm going to also ask you about another term. How would you define how would you define love as a young boy with your son and your mother?
Love, well, in relation, you said
love.
Son.
Yeah, as a son with your father, he exposed you.
Oh, okay.
Because sometimes people may get exposure.
Most definitely. So him and my mother always taught me that I was their son, and they considered me the ultimate blessing, but also reminded me that I was a son of Mother Africa. So to be an obedient son to the mother and father, that was a natural biological dynamic, but I had a historical responsibility to grow up to be the best son to Mother Africa I could possibly be, and all we try to do every day is honor that.
By chance, Obi, because I believe, if you don't mind, you were born in 1969.
Yes.
Have you strayed away from that solid foundation that you got?
Most definitely.
Okay.
Like any other child, I almost lost my life at 15 years old, hanging out in the streets of Northwest D.C. So never been involved in the blue-collar crime wave, but had many friends who succumbed to that. So the temptations are there. We're talking a decadent Western popular culture that tempts you with greed, that tempts you with arrogance, that tempts you with violence, and glorifies these dehumanizing aspects of the human construct. So like anyone else, we had to go through that. But once I had that experience, being stabbed, trying to break up a fight, I immediately did what Amilcar Cabral reminded us to do: return to the source, look at our foundation, and made a step towards back to the front line. My first march for the people was African Liberation Day, 1979. I was 9 years old, turning 10. So my parents wanted to make sure that, like I said, nothing was forced on me. but they planted the seeds in a very adequate manner. So once I was reintroduced to history, reintroduced to struggle, it was not something that I considered undigestible or intimidating.
Now, Obi, this might be a great time because I don't want to get through the show and not bring this up. Let's talk about your newborn son,
Mm-hmm.
I think Messiah Jean-Pierre.
Yes.
Because of the foundation that you got as a young boy, I'm assuming that already, I think he's about 3 months old or
Yeah, he's 11 weeks.
11 weeks. Okay.
Yes.
And so what you learned as a young boy,
Mm-hmm.
you're prepared to teach that.
Most definitely.
How-
And part of which, as the conversation continues, we have a lot of tools for African children.
Okay. I want to go real quick back to your father,
Mm-hmm.
because in reading some of your bio, I mean, your father had connections with a number of people, Kwame Nkrumah.
Yes.
He got some communication from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about why do you think your father was the kind of man that he was, a freedom fighter, I believe.
Yes, of the highest order. Hey, British colonialism would do that to you, but but it was his experience in London. Putting that in the context of what the great Paul Robeson said, he found Africa in Europe, and what he meant by that is now my father's in London now in the 1960s. So, in addition to being and before he even made his contribution politically, he sought to make his contribution culturally and artistically. His first book was written in 1964 called Wind versus Polygamy. And 2 years later, it was transcribed into a play. And it was Britain's submission to the first World and Arts Festival in Dakar, Senegal in the early part of 1966. And his highlight of that experience, as he explained it to me, is these two sophisticated men were watching the play. And one man asked the other one, how many songs do you think you could write to this? And that man said his head was spinning. And then the man who was the songwriter asked the man how many poems you think you could write to it. And he said he was thinking of some things. And then my father said he let them know that it was his play. And the two men were none other than Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes. So he said that that experience definitely let him know. And actually, that process there opened the doors for African literature from the continent to be embraced in Europe and in the West in particular. So from that, you saw Chinua Achebe take full advantage of that. Wole Soyinka take full advantage of that. And my father never wanted credit for that. But because of that experience and later on having a chance to develop a working relationship with Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, leader of the Convention People's Party, first president of Ghana, Ghana having the distinction of being the first nation to be free of settler colonial rule in Africa, and then of course being connected to Shirley Graham Du Bois as well, because he had written an essay called The Murder of Nigeria about the Igbo Biafran War.
And again, this is your father.
Yes.
Okay.
The Osagyefo saw it, loved it, felt it represented his sentiments. Shirley Graham Du Bois was the one who showed it to him. He was able to get to Guinea. This is the 50th anniversary of that visit. He went there in '68, 1 year before my birthday. So he understood from those experiences that our cultural and political expression must be synonymous. In many instances, we may have revolutionary cultural expression, but political expression that leaves a lot to be desired. And on the reverse, we can have very riveting, compelling political expression, but disgusting cultural expression. Okay. So the challenge is to balance them off.
Obi, I mean, that's some pretty deep information that you're passing on, and I'm amazed at how you, obviously it's ingrained in you, your DNA and who you are today. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the things that you are doing right now. And I believe you're an educator, mm-hmm. And you're also African historian, a playwright, and an organizer. Mm-hmm. Let's do this first.
Okay.
Let's talk about the organizing. Define the role of an organizer from Obi's perspective.
I would use the definition used by Frantz Fanon, fighter in Algeria, journalist, writer, physician, clinical psychiatrist, to be precise. He said to educate the masses of the people is to passionately and relentlessly teach them that everything depends on them. Because we live in a capitalist society, so much emphasis is put on the individual that even when we talk about organized resistance, We highlight charismatic spokespeople. That's why we know more about the individual than the organizations. Put a bunch of people in a room together, ask them many things about Dr. King, they could tell you a lot. Ask them to tell you 3 things about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the Montgomery Improvement Association. We know the answer. Ask them things about Malcolm and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. They could tell you a lot. Ask them about the Nation of Islam as an organization. Same thing. Ask them about Mandela, as this is his 100th birthday. This year marks that. Ask them anything about the African National Congress. Ask them about Dorothy Height in comparison to the National Council of Negro Women. It goes on and on. As a matter of fact, many people that talk about Rosa Parks all the time will argue you down that she was a member of the NAACP.
Obi, if Kanye West walked in here and said, okay, Obi, so what? Why is it relevant? How would you respond?
Oh, my answer would be simple. It is only relevant to those who would not sleep at night knowing they've compromised the future of generations yet to take their first breath. That's why it's relevant.
Okay. And do you think that, especially in the African American community, that this relevance is recognized?
Yes, and if not, I know exactly why. We're living in a moment where when you look at the education of the African child, there's an aggressive emphasis on STEM, mathematics and science. No problem with that. More Louis Ladimirs, good for us. More Benjamin Banekers, good for us. But not at the expense of propagating the notion that all areas of education that deal with critical thinking, the decolonization process, is no longer relevant, which means no more W.E.B. Du Bois, no more Carter G. Woodsons.
Okay. You hit on something that jumps out at me. You used the term critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And there are those who feel like critical thinking within the African American community is missing in action. You were an educator.
Mm-hmm.
A couple things. What is your view on that in terms of the if you will, the grade level of critical thinking with African Americans, and how do we ensure that is not something that's missing in action?
More organized activity aimed at children. Simple as that. Because yes, we must make geography appealing. We must make history appealing. We must make sociology appealing. We must make the arts appealing. We know that that's the challenge we face. But that's one of the most beautiful characteristics of history itself, is the challenges that it presents to you. You either embrace the challenges or run the other way when the challenges come your way.
But as an educator, and if you can be specific, for example, what grade level do you teach?
K through 12.
Okay, so you got them all pretty much.
Yes.
What specifically do you do as an educator to prepare them for critical thinking?
For example, since I'm an African history teacher, we come up with a formula where we use letters and numbers to teach them the African continent. I'll do the formula real quick if I may.
Sure.
A2, B4, C7, D2, E4, G5, K1, L3, M7, N3, R1, S10, T3, U1, Z2. The numbers represent the African countries that begin with that letter. So you're talking about Algeria, Angola, Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros Islands, Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt/Kemet, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gabon, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Ghana before that, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Libya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Saharan Arab Democratic Republic, Sao Tome and Principe, Senegal, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Swaziland, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe. We have children learning that from the kindergarten level.
Along with that, do you teach them, for example, we know in Africa you have a lot of natural resources, because what I found as a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger, they had those resources, but it's not the indigenous people who are benefited from that.
Of course, and the reason that I'm glad you brought that up, one of the things we've done for too long are 2 things. Number 1, we have allowed a narrative to be propagated that Africa is part of our glorious past. not our present and our future. And we teach them that the human resource is the most precious of all. And we say that we will no longer allow slavery, as it is called, captivity and colonialism to be taught in isolation from each other. So even before we get into Africa itself, we strategically focus on some of the historical figures who have unique experiences in Africa that are conveniently omitted from their profile. For example, no more teaching about Thurgood Marshall and just mentioning Brown versus Board and him being a Supreme Court justice. Infused the fact that he helped Kenya write their constitution, made it law that we couldn't reclaim our land in the streets from the Europeans. We had to go through the courts. No more discussing Dr. King and discussing Gandhi's influence on him philosophically, Emerson's influence on him philosophically, Thoreau's influence on him philosophically, and not mentioning Osagyefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's influence on him philosophically. They were the only political figures that looked like you and I on Time magazine in the 50s. And what Dr. King did in Montgomery, Nkrumah did in Ghana, calling it positive action, not nonviolence, but strikes, demonstrations, and boycotts, and chased the British out of Ghana. And King went there to pay respects in '57. So those are just a few examples. And the last one real quickly, so this is more like a conversation, not a lecture, I ain't no lecturer, is we always remind them of the very last line of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which we conveniently don't sing. True to our God, true to our native land. And we know how true to God we are. Imagine if we're true to Africa, like we've been true to Islam, true to Christianity, and the authentic or indigenous disciplines we have.
Once again, Obi, some very deep information. Question for you. So for the young student who get through the 12th grade in one of the schools that you've mentioned, how would you define that student compared to a student maybe from a public school, if you follow my question?
Well, we're in the public schools too, Brother Omar. We have access to nearly 50 schools in Birmingham, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, Marion, Alabama, Lowndes County, Alabama, and Montgomery. So that's where we fulfill our public school responsibility. Here in the district, private schools, we have a homeschool co-op we're part of called the Sankofa Homeschool Community where we teach at. So we teach our children public charter schools, we're with them, private schools, we're with them, homeschools, we're with them, African independent schools, we're with them. And we reach them all the same way, and they're being tempted by the same mechanisms. So popular culture seeks to influence them and indoctrinate them. So it doesn't matter the capacity. We just feel we need to be there.
But let me make sure I'm clear though, Obi. You mentioned public charter schools. You mentioned public schools. You mentioned schools. I think you said, did you say African independent schools? Now, help me out. I guess I was under the impression that some of the control that you might have in African independent school is not going to be some of the controls you're going to have in public charter schools and public schools.
No, we're embraced when we come in, because one of the things they have done, because as we know, the public schools, if you will, this is first-rate academic terrorism we're dealing with, because that's all Common Core is. But they have a problem. They put so much emphasis on math and science that now they have to worry about literature. Now they have to worry about writing. And what they have seen is children's response to reading and writing is based on things that speak specifically to them, that are relatable to them. So now the things that they have fought to try to exclude, they have to now reinfuse. As a matter of fact, I used to laugh all the time. The person who got me into teaching, may he rest in power, Kamau Robertson in Roots, one of the giants in terms of African independent education. I remember going to visit him one day, and he was livid. This was back when we were dealing with Afrocentricity and multiculturalism, and he was just up and down talking about multiculturalism, and I'm smiling like the Kool-Aid man. And he's like, "You think this is funny?" I said, "I know when the enemy is giving me a weapon and doesn't even realize it." He said, "What you talking about?" I said, "First of all, when they say multicultural, remember, they've been telling you that you're different than Africans born in Africa. So now they've created a platform for you to talk about Africa. Now they've created a platform for you to talk about our historical relationship to Native Americans, our historical relationship to the Vietnamese, our historical relationship to the Chinese, to all people who are no strangers to colonialism, rape, and plunder, and at the same time giving us a chance to Pan-Africanize the African narrative. How could we have a problem with that? So no problems, no problems at all. Taking advantage of every opportunity the enemy provides. Being very calculated and scientific about it, never emotional and sentimental though.
Okay, I'm going to move on from that public school, but it just sounds like to me, what little I know, that public schools, first of all, because of policies, usually they're policies that don't necessarily align with the African American community.
I'm going to give you a good example. I was in this school called Meadowview in Selma. Now, this is the last school in Selma. It's a magnet elementary school. It's the last school to desegregate in Selma. We know Selma's history. No need to go into that tonight. And we went in there a couple of years ago, and the principal, you know, he's waiting at the door. And he says, brother, and this is during the Jubilee, where they commemorate the Bloody Sunday demonstration every year. So he comes to me and he says, so you're going to take him beyond the bridge? So I didn't know what he was trying to say. I said, what you mean by that? What he was asking was I going to come in and just talk about Bloody Sunday? Was I just going to talk about Jimmy Lee Jackson? And he was saying that they learn that all the time. That's all they get. I told him, how about I'm going to only mention that in the beginning, and I'm going to do something entirely different. He said, how you going to approach it? I said, well, the first thing we're going to talk about is there was a demonstration in Grenada led by Maurice Bishop and the New Jew movement in the early 70s called Bloody Sunday. And they were also protesting against police terrorism in Grenada by Sir Eric Gary and the Mongoose Gang. And the reason we would do that is because we've let the Democrats and Republicans in a very Hitler-like fashion impose their definition of America on our people, especially in the field of education.
Okay, but Obi, I got to ask you this because I would like for our audience to be clear. When you use the term we, I always like for people to be very clear when they say we. Who are you when you say we?
When I'm down there, it's through this project called African History 365, which was spearheaded by State Senator Hank Sanders, who just retired. His daughter Malika Sanders took his place, and his wife Faya Rose Touré, known as Rose Sanders. They were the attorneys that were dealing with the case of the African farmers. But they created this initiative. So it's Dr. Tony Browder, Queen Mother Sanford, Isabel Sanford, and people like that who are pioneers in the field of education. And our main focus and concentration is modern history. So we were asked to come in and deal with that. So under that auspices, was able to get into the schools. So we get into this guy's school. So we start with that. We did the formula that we just did here. We did some poetry. And because we told him how we were going to approach the subject, he let us have an assembly impromptu. So we were just going to go into a couple of classes just for sample. We end up talking to the entire school.
Okay, interesting point when you say the entire school.
Yeah.
Is this, what's the racial makeup of these schools?
Oh, in Selma, there are 20,000 people, but Selma's overwhelmingly African. And I mean what is commonly referred to as African American. We don't use the term African in the United States. But what I was saying about America before, America is the Western Hemisphere geographically. That's North America, South America, Latin America, the Caribbean. And it's very important that we merge the 42 million Africans in North America with the 190 million Africans in the Americas to show that the first form of public transportation was the slave ship. But not only that, in the future, we want our children to be just as knowledgeable about our resistance in Selma, our resistance in Alabama, our resistance in Maryland, our resistance in South Carolina, connecting that to our resistance in Cuba, our resistance in the Dominican Republic, our resistance in Honduras, our resistance in Haiti, our resistance in Jamaica. So that's what we talk about. So saying that when we use America, that's what we mean.
Once again, very fascinating information. I have to ask you this. With the young people, so what you're teaching, they are absorbing it to the point that they really understand. And here's another very simple question I wanted to ask you. Are these students, in your opinion, for example, are they TV watchers? And because we know the poison of TV. Yeah, okay, but that's why I was curious as to whether or not they're really absorbing what's being taught. And here's the other thing too. As you know, we have a color issue not only with whites and blacks, but we have it within our community, the light versus the dark skin.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something that's covered in some of the schools that you're teaching?
Um, when you show them this here, we just show them they connected. We're past that. I mean, that's part of the decolonization process,
Right.
yes. So yeah, you talk about the paper, but you teach them about the history of the paper bag concept, the doll test that Dr. Kenneth Clark developed to ensure that we would prevail in Brown versus Board of Education. In Algeria, Frantz Fanon wrote in his third book, Toward the African Revolution, about what's called the North African Syndrome. That's part of the decolonization process. But once you tell them they're African, and we, like I said, we do poems now. So one poem that all of them learn and are very enthusiastic about, regardless of their complexion, regardless of how they're being raised spiritually, they like this one here. I have a lot of sisters, I have a lot of brothers, I have a lot of cousins, I have a lot of uncles, I have a lot of aunties, but we all have the same mother. She's my mother's mother, she's my father's mother, she's my grandparents' mother, she's my great-grandparents' mother, she's my ancestors' mother. The mother that we talk about is Mother Africa. The mother that we talk about is Mother Africa. We must defend our mother by standing up for our mother. We must come together in the name of our mother. We all love our mother, we all love our mother, we all love our mother. That not only deals with that aspect of the identity question, but it challenges one of the fundamental aspects of what the capitalist system seeks to impose culturally, the nuclear family. Going beyond Cliff and Claire Huxtable or James and Florida Evans, we tell them your family's in 125 countries, 55 in Africa, 70 in the diaspora. Your whole family ain't coming to your graduation, they ain't coming to your wedding, they're not coming to your funeral, but you still know by blood that is family.
How does interracial marriage, especially in America these days, tie into your educational process with our children?
We give them historical examples. Frantz Fanon, interracial marriage. Amiri Baraka's first marriage, interracial.
Frederick
Personal,
Douglass.
that's more of a, Frederick Douglass. I mean, the list goes on.
Right.
That's more personal. But the bottom line is we get everybody on the front line, on the battlefield, organizing our people, then we'll remedy that.
Okay.
So if you want to say that that's their contradiction, then that means that they should shed more blood than everyone else, pour more sweat on the front line. So if they do that, we fill that up. And the interesting thing about that is too many times we hear people who have never shed blood, who've never given any sweat, who've never given any labor, overly critical about those who gave their lives to the people, using that as an example. But we do understand sending the strongest cultural statements, sending the strongest historical statements, and sending the strongest political statements are of paramount importance. So I get where you're coming from.
So who are some of these, I'm going to call them naysayers?
Just everyday sisters and brothers. And you know, one
okay.
of the, yeah, they just be
So you're not just talking about white America, you're talking about
I'm
sisters
talking
within
about,
our community.
I'm talking about amongst us. But one of the things that we know is we always seek to guide our nationalism. And we want to guide our nationalism to its highest expression, which is Pan-Africanism, where we say we're for everyone. And then it goes to socialism, where we go back to the thing that the human resource is the most important, and the human resource dictates what happens with the material resources. And when we retake control of Africa, we will make sure that every African benefits from the gold, the diamonds, the copper, the uranium, the oil, the abundance of resources we have. Because until we've done that, we've got unfinished business.
Another question popped up, Obi. We're educating our children about our African connection. In your experience, are the Africans educating their children about the African American? And I repeat that question.
Africans in diaspora, period. There's more curiosity and okay, another poem that we have to deal with this. Even though we are linguistically the most diverse people the world has known, right? Our ancestors created 5,000 languages, something like that, but we communicate primarily in 7: English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, German, Italian, and Arabic. And the most compelling writing about the African experience has been in colonial language, not in indigenous language. But this is how we explain that to our children. It's a language poem we have. I'll do it real quick if I may. Africans here in the U.S. are English-speaking Africans. Africans in Trinidad are English-speaking Africans. Africans in Jamaica are English-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Ghana, just like Africans who live in Kenya, just like Africans who live in Zimbabwe. English-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Haiti are French-speaking Africans. Africans in Martinique are French-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Guinea, just like Africans who live in Algeria, just like Africans who live in the Congo. French-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Cuba are Spanish-speaking Africans. Africans in Venezuela are Spanish-speaking Africans. Africans in Colombia are Spanish-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Equatorial Guinea, Spanish-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Brazil are Portuguese-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Mozambique, just like Africans who live in Angola, just like Africans who live in Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. We're all Africans, we're all Africans, we're all Africans. Learn to embrace it, learn to celebrate it, learn to defend it.
Once again, Obi, you're intoxicating me here with this information.
And we got, and like I said, we've got children, we've got the babies doing this, Brother Omar. And see, and the thing about that, if you caught the poem, we start with places in the diaspora, then we do the continent. So English-speaking Africans in Ghana are learning more about the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey than they ever have. They can read anything they want. It's in English. Africans in Kenya are learning more about the Underground Railroad than ever before because everything is in English. So Africans in Haiti have access to the revolution in Algeria, the revolution in Guinea, the revolution in the Congo, because you don't need Rosetta Stone. It's the same colonial language. So that's what I see being exploited more than ever before. And in the future, I'm enthusiastic, will be exploited by us for our collective benefit, empowerment, and upliftment.
Obi, for some of the viewers who might have students and maybe they're contemplating, okay, where do I send my child? Let me ask you this question. Let's say that student who's graduating and then they want to attend the college. And how are they prepared as well to take the SAT, for example?
It depends what they've done leading up to that. And there are many efforts in our community, organized efforts to prepare them for the math, to prepare them for the science, to prepare them for the history. But I think that it goes back to why are they going to school? And once again, this speaks to the question of the brain drain. If you're talking to me on the African continent, Africa's best lawyers, Africa's best doctors, Africa's best engineers, Africa's best scientists, they work in France, they work in Portugal, they work in Washington, they work in New York. That will be reversed, but it's a question of history. Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah came to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, HBCU. He goes back to Ghana. After reading Philosophy and Opinions of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, he goes to fight. Eduardo Mondlane, leader of the Mozambican struggle, founder of Frelimo, the Revolutionary Front of Mozambique, went to Oberlin College. Nnamdi Azikiwe, leader of the Nigerian anti-colonial movement, went to Lincoln University before Nkrumah did. As a matter of fact, he gave Nkrumah a letter of recommendation. He goes back to Nigeria and gets involved in struggle. Those are the examples we have to give our people. Now, if you're born on the continent, your perception of helping Africa is buying all the fancy equipment, fancy things in Costco and sending them to Africa. Well, no. It's getting back to the front line.
Let me push back just a little bit. And this is not a negative, but I'm just basing this on my experience in Niger many years ago. There were a number of those students who went to study in France. And there are a lot of them who, and I shouldn't say a lot, but a number of them who did not want to come back to Niger.
Of course, that's what we're speaking of. But they didn't, and I guarantee you, they never got those historical examples of people who went to get education in their country's former colonizers and came back with the ultimate conviction to liberate the people. That's going back to what you were asking about my father. When my father was in London, let me give you the lineup. So while my father's in London dealing with the Panthers, you got Tony Martin there working with the students born in the Caribbean. You got Walter Rodney there doing his PhD. You got Maurice Bishop, the leader of the New Jewel movement in Grenada, at Gray's Inn doing law. You got Fela Kuti over there studying music. So it depends on the atmosphere, it depends on the environment. And we know that now on the college level, whether we're speaking at HBCUs, J. Edgar Hoover let it be known in the 1970s, these HBCUs have turned into a training ground for the highest level of political activism. Let me do everything I can to reverse that. These Africans now, in the context of immigration, if you compare them to people who migrate here from Europe, migrate here from Asia, we have the highest level of college graduates that come here, the highest level of high school graduates who come here, the highest level of PhDs who come here. So, and then they sign a pact not to be politically active when they're here. But the only exception is, real quickly, the only exception is if you're coming here from a country that's defiant and stands up to the United States. If you come here from Zimbabwe and say you hate Emerson Mnangagwa, he's just as wicked as Robert Mugabe was, they let you right in. If you come here from Cuba and say you're tired of that revolution, you get the green light. If you come here from Venezuela and say you want to get rid of Maduro, they'll let you come here. So the question of immigration is what your political outlook is, and are you willing to be like a remote controlled car and serve the interests of the West and compromise the integrity of your people where you were born?
Is that connected to, you mentioned signing a pact? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, and it's done all the time.
Okay.
So, but once again, when we erupt finally inside the borders of the United States, inside the Americas, we'll take care of all of that. Because the thing is, if we give people the impression that being here is on heaven on earth because of the examples how you can excel as an individual, as opposed to looking at what our collective predicament is, that's where the confusion is spread.
Okay, you mentioned, Obi, you used the word when we erupt. What's your projection as to when we're going to erupt? And if I follow your definition of erupt, what came to my mind is, because I always do this on my show, I think about the prison population.
Oh, yeah.
I think about the gay population. I talked earlier about interracial marriages.
Yeah, you did.
So when you say when we erupt, help our audience understand just what you mean, and perhaps maybe even if there's a timeline that you're looking at.
Well, that one is always tricky because I don't want to be come off like a meteorologist to tell you it's going to rain and then you go outside and it's a sunny day. So no, we won't do that. But I'll just say we can just look at what's going on.
Okay.
And we have to be very calculating in what we're paying attention to, because I guess you're speaking of the current developments in this country right now.
Yeah, and let me just say this, because this is what's critical, at least to me on this show. We want relevancy in terms of, we look at where the African American is in America today. So, yes.
Okay. Well, you mentioned prisons. If you're organizing in prisons, I've been doing work in prisons through different organizations since I was a student in the 1990s. At UDC, my alma mater, we had Lorton College Prison Program. I remember a brother named Simba Sana, who's one of the co-founders of Caribou Books, for people who remember Caribou Books. He now wrote his memoirs. He took us into Lorton in 1993. They had a Malcolm X study group in Lorton. The book they read was Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon's final book that he wrote on his deathbed. They wanted us to come in and lead a conversation about that, facilitate a conversation rather. We didn't lead anything. And of course, we were very humbled by that because we knew that at UDC, at Spelman, at Fisk, at Howard, and all the 117 HBCUs we have, what percentage of the students you think had read Wretched of the Earth? So we saw what these brothers were doing that night, and we told them how humbled we were just to be in their presence. So we know the challenges in terms of, so we're looking for the George Jacksons and the Malcolm X's, and they are there.
I believe that.
If we're dealing with the medical students, for example, you talk to them about people like Augustino Neto. You talk to them about people like Frantz Fanon, who use those skills to uplift their people. If we're talking to people who are into agronomy, we let them know about this man on our shirt, Amilcar Cabral, who taught people the same things that George Washington Carver taught us in Tuskegee for 46 years, but he was turning those people into guerrilla fighters who knew agriculture, and they liberated Guinea-Bissau from Portuguese colonialism. So it's just about whoever we're talking to, it goes back to this question of re-embracing the African fighting spirit and letting people know that organizing your people is not an option, but a historical obligation. And when we take that approach, we already know that we're going to clash with those who have been propagating creating the narrative that voting is your historical responsibility, but organizing your people, which is the reason we even are voting in the first place, is an option. That's why you got so many people beating their chests like King Kong on the Empire State Building when they vote, and those same people won't organize a minute, organize a second. They're confused historically.
Again, I'm going to remind our audience of our title, Alternative Education with a Self-Esteem Foundation, because one of the things, Obi, that I'm very clear on in terms of who you are, your self-esteem, you were blessed that early on that you were guided. Obi, in terms of competition, and again, I want to focus on the African American community, and our young students.
Africans in the United States or Africans in the Americas?
Well,
I'm just messing with you.
no, and I like that. I like that. It probably should be Africans all around in the world.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about in terms of where we are, since I'm in the United States right now, and I'm just very concerned about what I see is what is happening to African Americans. Now, I was just curious. I had a little note here. I use the term competition.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I tell my daughters is that at one time it was about black and white. Now you have Hispanic, you have Asians, and there's a new group, in my opinion, that's here in America, and they seem to be very serious about what they're trying to do. And I think about their history in their country, and I'm talking about the Indians. But I guess what I'm asking you, and maybe it's relevant and maybe it's not, is there any, do you see any competition among the students, for example, that you educate?
As a matter of fact, we were in rehearsal the other night. We have an upcoming play called Araminta and Samora, Treating the Sick, Liberating the Oppressed. Another example of what we talked about earlier. Harriet Tubman, as we know, Araminta Ross, that's her birth name. She was a nurse. We called her Moses, so she definitely was a liberator. The first president of the Republic of Mozambique, Samora Machel, his middle name is Moises, which is Portuguese for Moses. And he was a nurse. Before he joined the liberation struggle in Mozambique, he was a nurse. So obviously we wanted to make that parallel there. So now every time Harriet Tubman is taught, you got to teach Samora Machel as well. But anyway, the students were rehearsing, and one of the students said, "You never let us audition for parts." I said, "No, because we don't want to encourage competition. We want to encourage unity, because competition is one of the main aspects of capitalism. So we don't want competition, we want unity." And so that's very important that we plant that seed as early as possible. Because when you say competition, and if you're talking about competition in the job market, competition in the academic world, that's not what we're dealing with. There's no competition on the front line fighting for the liberation of your people, because there's room for everybody, whoever dares to embrace their responsibility and fight.
And I love that explanation, but I got to push back just a little bit.
Sure.
Because when you expect unity, you expect all players to some degree to be receptive to that.
Most definitely.
And if that's not the case, how do you prepare for those pockets of resistance? Because to me, I know I don't want my daughters to be blind to that resistance. So I understand what you're saying. Unity is fine if everybody wants unity. But what about those elements and those pockets of resistance?
All we can do is just organize by example, and through that, and of course the countless historical examples we have, just giving them exposure to those. Because the interesting thing is, in terms of individual standouts, some of our most selfless fighters were outstanding as individuals. Many people forget Marion Barry passed up a PhD program in chemistry to lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Would we have benefited more from him if he stayed a chemist or if he led SNCC? SNCC, who led the struggle to fight the Vietnam War. SNCC, who raised the question of black power amongst their generation. SNCC, who kept SCLC and Dr. King and the rest of the civil rights groups honest, being the most militant of them all. So you give them examples of people. If I want a child to be a teacher, I'm going to show them Du Bois. I'm going to show them Carter G. Woodson. Geniuses of the highest order, but very humble and uncompromising based on their responsibility to their people. Like I said, if we want them to be agronomists, we'll push them in the direction of Cabral. If they want to be writers, we'll push them, journalists, we'll push them in the direction of Daisy Bates. We'll push them in the direction of J.A. Rogers. So that way, we're not compromising on the question of promoting excellence, but we are highlighting and magnifying excellence that submits to the collective each and every time, which puts us in diametrical opposition to capitalist values, which is what we want, because that's cultural warfare that we won't be liberated unless we wage.
Well,
and we're going to win, too.
Let me just say this. Your point is well taken about Marion Barry, because I thank God I had a chance to interview him, and I thank God he didn't pursue that PhD. Yeah. So, but real quick, because I know time is moving.
Yes.
You and I, before we came on camera, we talked about a couple things. One, we talked about the impact of male educators, their absence in many areas.
Yes.
So can you talk about that briefly? And then the other one I do want to talk briefly about is financial management and teaching our young folks about economics.
Yes. The male achievement thing, once again, is going back and just giving them this rich list of teachers we have. So if I'm in the public schools, for example, in D.C., I've been in Roosevelt in D.C., and I've been in Dunbar in D.C. in the last couple of years. When I went in Dunbar, I asked them who Grace Adlai Brown was. Well, I asked them, did they even know the history of Dunbar High School, the first school for Africans, high school for Africans in modern times, formerly the M Street Colored School. So we talked about Anna Julia Cooper to them. We talked to them, many people don't know that the mother of the great poet Sterling Brown, Grace Adlai Brown, she taught in the public schools in D.C. for 50 years. Dr. Woodson, before he went to Howard, before he set up the foundation for West Virginia State University, he was at Armstrong. That's what he came to this area to do. And when he wrote his PhD, The Disruption of Virginia, he was going from Armstrong to the Library of Congress every day. So once we give them examples of teachers who look just like them, we deal with that question. They have to see examples of people who look like them, who represent their experience. Then they'll feel more comfortable pursuing these choices in terms of skills that they'd like to harness to make a contribution to our community. And we remember that right now, we're on the, it's almost about to die. We're trying to bury it. This whole concept of telling them to give back. No, we don't want you to give back. We want you to give first. Dr. King was correct when he said life's most urgent and persistent question is, what are you doing for others? Once again, we're going to clash with mainstream culture over their values every time we can. And they can't touch us either.
We're going to talk about the money, but I was curious. I have a question here. A little note that says, where is all this history, Obi, in terms of why it's not being exposed daily? I mean, I have my reasons and understanding as to where it is, but I want to get your comment.
Oh, it's being, this is the thing. We tell you can equate it to fishing. You have a worm on the hook, right? So it's bait. We don't teach, many people come to us all the time. You don't have classes for adults. No, and we more than likely never will unless they organize it. We teach history not to our children, through our children. When those children go home, Brother Omar, and they're reciting those African countries, you don't think their parents' eyebrows are raised? Matter of fact, methodologically speaking, we don't give them traditional homework. We just tell them what you learned today, you wrote it, go home and share this with your parents. See if they know it. If they don't, they learn that they have just as much ability to educate the community as the adult does. So if their parents don't know that information and the first time they're hearing it is from the child they brought into this world, mission accomplished. If the parent is blessed to have got that information, the child is to record when they got it. And the one thing they're learning from that is that they're getting the exposure at a much earlier age. 2 years ago, that African formula, the formula with the countries I did, we had a 12-year-old go to an advanced class on African diaspora studies at Howard University. And he taught that formula in front of the class. And he called me and said the student that knew the most only knew 10. But since he'd been around me since he was 7 years old, he couldn't fathom how at Howard University, based on its aura, based on its reputation, how that was even possible. I had to explain to him. But it did wonders for him. So this is how we approach it. So one thing about it, number one, because we take a Pan-Africanist approach to the history, it's always going to pique people's curiosity. And our people are more curious about the African experience than ever before. Nothing's going to stop it.
And we're going to talk about that money, but I got to tie in
okay.
my experience with this young man at Howard. It reminded me, Obi, I did an informal survey at a number of black schools sent it to the business department, to the dean, asking how many people knew Reginald Lewis. And and to my surprise, the schools responded, their business students. Most of them, and Reginald Lewis I'm talking about was the founder of Beecher's Food.
Yes.
But most of them identify, I think there was another Reginald Lewis who was a basketball player.
Yeah.
And so...
with the Boston Celtics that played in Baltimore Dunbar.
Yeah. And like that young 12-year-old, and I was much older, I was kind of blown away that in the business school that they would not have known someone like a Reginald Lewis who went to an HBCU,
Yes.
and then of course he went to Howard. He went to Virginia State University, I believe. Started Beecher's Food. But so when you mentioned that about the young boy, matter of fact, what did you tell him in terms of when he said, how could that be?
I said that's why we work with you,
Okay.
to break the cycle. Of course. So so that way we're showing them it's about developing solutions to, I won't say problems, but challenges, and challenges that we embrace enthusiastically.
Right. Let's get to the money, financial management, economics, Obi. As an educator in the environments that you're working in, what's the formula? How do we
deal with economics? Right. It goes back to something that Dr. Woodson, I think, which is one of the most phenomenal aspects of The Miseducation of the Negro as a book. When we used to go into the group homes, detention centers, to teach young people constitutional law, we highlighted the 9th chapter, Political Education Neglected. And as we know, the book is written in 1933. And Dr. Woodson talks about the fact that at the beginning of official segregation of the public schools, before we got the hand-me-down social studies textbooks and history books, they would sit in a room and literally rip out the pages of the Bill of Rights and rip out the Constitution. And so when we have our children's favorite basketball players and football players and entertainers saying they're role models, through critical thinking, they'll pose the question, how can you be a role model and you've never been taught your role in society? How do you know your role in society if you don't know how society functions? And the reason that I bring that up is because, once again, we don't really understand the full impact of living under the capitalist system. At a historical moment, when, according to Forbes magazine, there are 2,063 billionaires on the planet worth $8 trillion, and at the same historical moment, there are 1 billion hungry people. And the reason that we bring that up is because Ahmed Sekou Touré said it best, leader of the Guinea Revolution. It is not the adaptation of political action to economic action. On the contrary, it is the use of economic activities for political ends. We don't even finance our own organizations fighting for our people. When the NAACP, most people will tell you their best contribution is Brown versus Board of Education. When they did that, they were surviving off poor people's dues. Thurgood Marshall was going around sleeping on people's couches. Charles Hamilton Houston, who taught him, was sleeping on people's couches when they were in the South teaching people education. We must finance our own organizations. If we're organized and we accept that the human resource is not only the world's most valuable, but has a responsibility to deal with the flow of natural resources, we'll deal with all the world's problems. And part of understanding this economic question, because it's not about producing more billionaires, it's not about producing more millionaires, it's about the eradication of hunger and the eradication of poverty and us having firm control of Africa. That's why they come after Zimbabwe with reckless abandon. That's why they come after Eritrea with reckless abandon. That's why they come after Cuba and Bolivia and Venezuela with reckless abandon, because these are countries that understand that concept and have built their whole defense around what inherently belongs to them around that concept.
Well, once again, Obi, so much powerful information, and I appreciate the education. Again, it's intoxicating, and I only have a few minutes left. And I want you to quickly, I'm gonna bring in your young son again.
Yes.
Messiah Jean-Pierre. 3 key lessons that you plan to share with him, so our audience with children out there, they will know. And if you can make them brief, because in the end, I want to do a quick dedication to the young man who was killed in Illinois. So, 3 quick points that Messiah Jean-Pierre is going to get from his father,
Um,
especially as a young black man?
uh, Young African, as I'm gonna tell
Okay,
him. I'm,
young,
yeah,
okay.
I'm messing with you, man. But
No, I
no,
love it. I love it.
he organize, and organize some more.
Okay,
And anything else, and anything we share with him will always be within that framework.
okay,
Organize, and organize some more.
okay. I'm going to let you set up this quick point. I know time is moving. I'm going to let you set up my tribute. Based on your education, based on your exposure, based on your organizational expertise, what is your message, real quick, about police brutality in the African community?
Africans everywhere, part of the unification process, is breaking this cycle of police terrorism, which is tied to United States, European Union military repression and violence. We must stop them from policing the world, stop them from terrorizing the world. We've gone from slave chains to handcuffs, from slave ships to prison cells. We must break the cycle. And so we don't kneel before the U.S. flag at the instructions of a Green Beret, and that becomes the reason that we'll talk about being policed inside the United States borders, but then turn Charlie Chaplin completely silent when confronted about stopping them from policing the world. And that's in the manifestation of overt police terrorism, military repression through the military apparatus of all the European countries in the United States, but also diplomatic terrorism. And I'm going to end with something that
Yeah, because I only have 2 minutes, so I want to do that tribute to that, brother.
and President Obama's first inauguration address, he said the might of the U.S. military must be matched by the strength of their diplomacy. And from that attitude comes blockades on Cuba, sanctions on Zimbabwe, sanctions on Eritrea just lifted the other day. We must fight them every step of the way. You won't police our neighborhoods, you won't police the world.
Obi, God bless you, and thank you very
so
much for the
Thanks.
information.
And I hope that we met your expectations tonight, and we hope your audience is pleased with
And
us
I'm
as
sure
well.
that they are just
We
thoroughly enjoy it.
thank Mama Gloria
Miss Gloria
Fleming for
Fleming,
the
right, the
opportunity.
producer.
And we salute you for your consistent service using this platform for the people.
And thank you, Obi. I just want to quickly acknowledge the very sad shooting of a young African American by the name of, I believe, Jamel Robinson, 26 years old, a security guard doing his job, trying to prevent perhaps a murder or a killing, and lost his life to a police officer who was so quick to use his gun rather than do what was right. But thank you for watching our program, and we want to thank our very special guest. And we hope that you will join us in the next program of Africa's Vision Network. Thank you very much.